Lewis County will be one of only 2 counties in the entire state to test what could be a life-saving program.
Lawmakers hope it will be a long-term solution for the challenges that rural EMS departments face.
In Northern News Now's Madison Green spoke to the Northland State Senator who helped put together the program and breaks it down for us in studio.
The pilot program is part of the EMS bill that most recently passed unanimously in the state Senate and is now left to Governor Walz to sign. It is called the Sprint Medic Program and would help alleviate the struggles rural Minnesota counties are facing. The program would only be implemented in Otter Tail County in central Minnesota and the northern part of St. Louis County. It would involve sprint cars with fully trained and equipped medics roaming designated areas of the county similar to police patrols. The idea, according to Senator Grant Hochschild of Hermantown, is these cars would be the first to arrive on scene to a medical emergency and provide assistance. They then would be able to determine if an ambulance is necessary while giving aid. When I spoke to Hochschild, he said he has spoken to many ambulance directors on the Iron Range who are already trained providing these services. Eliminating the immediate response of an ambulance and sending the sprint cars instead also cuts down on the costs the county must then absorb without denying residents the care they need.
When someone calls 911, regardless of their zip code, regardless if they live in the metro or a rural community, their expectation is that an ambulance or a paramedic show up to save their life. And that's exactly what we're getting at with the heart of this sprint car medic model.
St. Louis County would receive about $3 million of the $6 million allotted for the program. Hochschild says he believes that Governor Walz will sign the EMS bill with the Sprint Medic program very soon.
Madison, thank you. Now, if Governor Walz signs the bill, the Sprint Medic program would begin in 2025.